Hey, babes, you think you could move that blanket and pillow so, 'cause all the people are saying, even with the lipstick, we'd rather look at her, so. Great, thanks, bro. What's wrong? What do you mean it's not letting you sign in? Here, come over and show me. You got it? Alright, great. Okay, carrying on. So the self strikes back one. The transcendent self. Even though the arguments we considered in the last two chapters may seem entirely convincing, they have not convinced everyone. Indian Buddhists got pushback from their Orthodox Indian interlocutors, and contemporary no-self theorists are engaged in debate with proponents of the existence of the self who are influenced by the European phenomenological tradition. Wonder whether Dr. Schachtman would say that would attribute her reluctance, because anytime, if you explain, because the other author I'm interviewing is Dr. Maria Schechtman, okay, and she believes, well, she doesn't really, I won't say she believes one way or the other, actually. I'm gonna instead phrase it as, I should keep this book up while I'm talking about her. I'll instead phrase it as, she doesn't really see the appeal of calling the self an illusion. And I wonder whether she would attribute that to being influenced by the European phenomenological tradition. Don't really know what that means, to be honest, because I don't know much about the history of philosophy. Um, so the Indians are arguing about it between the Indian Buddhists and the Orthodox Indians. The Westerners are arguing about it between the the no self theorists, such as lots of examples, but this guy, Jay Garfield, and other people who he says are influenced by the European phenomenological tradition. Considering these arguments enables us to develop a deeper understanding of what is at stake in such debates. Each of the principal counterarguments figures both in classical Indian and contemporary Western debates about the self. In this chapter, we will first consider a classic argument for the reality of the self that we find both in early modern Europe and in ancient India. We will then consider a set of transcendental arguments for the existence of the self. Bro, it would bring me so much pleasure if you came up here. No? Oh, let me close this. Close this. Okay. Come on. Yeah. Whatever. All right, but you can't really like come up. You won't be visible, bro. I do love the visit though. Thank you. In this chapter, we will first consider a classic argument for the reality of the self that we find both in early modern Europe and in ancient India. We will then consider a set of transcendental arguments for the existence of the self. In the next chapter, we will consider some contemporary reconceptualizations of what a self might be. This discussion may sometimes get a little bit technical, and it will bring us into direct dialogue with some philosophers who have defended the reality of the self. It may sometimes be hard to see the forest for the trees, but if we are to get really clear about this issue, okay, well, speak for yourself, lady. But if we are to get really clear about this issue and to appreciate why those who believe that there is a self are committed to that position, we must follow the most important arguments on each side of the debate. Appreciation of the details enables us to address the ethical and existential implications of our lives as selfless persons in greater depth. Urioktakara, Ariotakara, and Descartes. The necessity of the self for consciousness. There is one quick argument that many have seen as a direct route to proving the reality of the self. We encounter it in both the Indian and European contexts. I call it the Cartesian argument because its best known Western source is Descartes' Meditations. But it occurs much earlier in the work of the Indian philosopher Uritakara. In the 7th century. There's also an Islamic precedent for the argument in Ibn Sina's flying man thought experiment. In Descartes' formulation, it is known as the cogito argument, abbreviating the dictum that lies at its heart, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I exist. The literature on this argument and on its role in Descartes' project in the Meditations is vast. Much of the discussion of that argument, however, is beside the present point. For our purposes, it is only relevant to note that while this argument is sometimes taken to demonstrate the reality of the self, it don't fucking succeed in doing so. The argument has a single premise, cogito, I am thinking. Let us first ask what follows from that premise. So that premise, I am thinking, immediately entails that at the moment when it is asserted, there is thought. Thought, however, is not a self. It therefore does not follow immediately that I am a self, right? And if you conjugate it so that there's an implied subject, right? I, cogito, I. Or if you look at it in English, I am thinking, it's circular, bro, because you've asserted that there is an I, and then you go and say, therefore there is an I. What? But this is not the end of the story, as we must concede thought requires a thinker, and perhaps that thinker would have to be a self. Indeed, when Descartes draws the next important conclusion in the chain of argument in which the cogito figures, it is sum res cogitans. I am a thinking thing. And that is a reasonable inference, so long as we restrict it, as Descartes does, to the moments when I am, in fact, thinking, and so long as we don't smuggle in any account of what kind of thing that thinker is. So the argument does demonstrate that Descartes, you and I are, at least sometimes, thinking things, agents of thought, but that still doesn't get us to the conclusion that we are selves, as we don't yet have any reason to believe that agents of thought must be selves. It is therefore necessary, if this argument is to convince us that we have selves, to show that a thinking thing must be a self. So, in order to show this, Uriotakara and Descartes each go further. To understand that path onward, we must take a detour into their accounts of what it is to be a thing or an object. Each account is committed to a fairly common view in classical metaphysics, the view that to be an object is to be a substance with properties. So this would have been a useful thing to have in mind when I was engaged with Ohm yesterday or the day before, when he was talking about the self as being pure awareness. Awareness could be considered a process or a property, but what's the substance? To which he would probably say, oh, it is not a substance. To which I would say, okay, well, that's just words then. Let us begin by getting a sense of the intuitive pull of this metaphysical position and how it is intended to function as a bridge to take us from the idea that we are thinking things to the conclusion that we are selves. Consider the apple on my desk. It does seem that the apple... Here's the apple, bro. It does seem that the apple can't be just... No, I'll just get an apple. Okay, bro. Up here, come down. Thank you. All right. So, where am I? Okay, so consider the apple on my desk. It does seem that the apple can't be just its roundness, redness, and sweetness. It is, we might think, the thing that is round, red, and sweet. That is, one might think that there must be some basic stuff that bears those properties, or in which those properties inhere. To use the technical term philosophers use for the relationship between substances and their properties, inhering, like a thing is inherent. So I'm going to be distracted actually because so obviously, I'm realizing a little bit late that he's going to make the case that persons sort of aren't reducible to or aren't identical to and aren't different from their substance, but also they are not their substance. Um, yeah, that's because there isn't a singular substance that to which you can attribute all of the properties. So maybe I didn't make a fool of myself when I was talking about the awareness thing. Because the problem with the that saying that we are pure awareness, saying that we are this process or property, um, can still be that you aren't giving that property or process an instantiation. Great. Okay, so back to the apple on my desk. So one might think that there must be some basic stuff that bears those properties or in which those properties inhere, to use the technical term philosophers use for the relation between substances and their properties. On this view, it seems that when we refer to the apple itself, we don't refer to its properties. Instead, we refer to an enduring base that supports those properties and that acquires other properties as it changes. Some thing that is now round, red, and sweet, but which once was green and sour, and which soon might be squishy and somewhat rotten. This is the intuition that motivates thinking of objects, including people, as substances with attributes. And that's just the way that the brain is, the way that we are, the way that we process things. Um, Yeah, and it's almost inconceivable to imagine not seeing this as a substance. So this is probably going to get pretty tricky, and trippy is what I was going to say actually. Uriotakara and Descartes each argue that thought is a property or an action of a thinking thing, just as redness is a property of my apple. Since properties can only inhere in substances and actions can only be undertaken by substantial agents, they each conclude that thinkers are substantial agents. And to be such a substantial agent is to be a self, that special kind of substance in which thought inheres or that performs acts of thought. So, in this argument, the conclusion that we are substantial selves depends on a bridge, the premise that only substances can have properties, perform actions, or maintain their identity through time. Okay, so that's the bridge. The premise that only substances can have properties, perform actions, or maintain their identity through time. But I guess sets of substances can conventionally have properties, perform actions, or maintain, or be said to be maintaining their identity through time. To discuss this metaphysical view, what motivates it, and to address everything that is wrong with it, would take us far afield. And we will not go there. But we don't have to. As soon as we spell this idea out, we can see that it will run into insuperable problems. The first and most obvious is that nobody has ever seen such propertyless substance, and it plays no role in any scientific theory. What? So in this argument, the conclusion that we are substantial selves depends on a bridge, the premise that only substances can have properties, perform actions, or maintain their identity through time. To discuss this metaphysical view, what motivates it, and to address everything that is wrong with it would take us far afield, and we will not go there. But we don't have to. As soon as we spell this idea out, we can see that it will run into insuperable problems. The first and most obvious is that nobody has ever seen such a propertyless substance, and it plays no role in any scientific theory. That is, there is no good positive reason to believe that substance is real, or that the substance attribute way of thinking about apples or persons makes any sense. It is, we might say, little more than a metaphor. So yeah, there's no such thing as a substance without properties. So properties are like real, and then we attribute them to a substance because just like in English we have to say it rains, we need like there to be a substance associated with these properties. I think that's what's going on. All right. So moreover, so I'll read that sentence again. So as soon as we spell out this idea that only substances can have properties, etc., we can see that it's going to run into some insurmountable problems. So one, the first and most obvious is that nobody has ever seen a propertyless substance. There's no reason to believe that substance just by itself is real, or that the substance attribute way of thinking about apples or persons makes any sense. It is, we might say, little more than a metaphor. Moreover, as Bishop George Berkeley in the 1700s argues in his 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, there is an easy route to showing the incoherence of this view, as it generates a vicious infinite regress of substance and relations. This is because the supposed inherence relation that connects properties to the substances in which they are meant to inhere is a relation, and a relation is a property of a pair of things. For instance, the fact that Talisker is my dog means that he and I are connected by the relation of dog ownership. Another way to say that is that together we have the property of dog and owner. Now, if the substance attribute picture is right, this property inheres in the pair of us. So far, there's no big problem, but here comes the kicker. Since inherence is a relationship between a substance and its properties, it itself must also be a property, and this sets up the vicious regress, for then inherence must inhere in yet another substance, and that inherence needs yet another substantial basis, and so on ad infinitum. Okay. The lack of any scientific evidence for substance is one good methodological reason to reject the substance attribute picture as unsupported. This regress argument is a second good reason. So let's just hear that again. Right. Okay. Got you. And the key thing is inherence itself must also be a property. Okay. Okay. So let's read that again. Okay. So Bishop George Berkeley argues that there's an infinite regress of substances and relations. Okay, so this is because the supposed inherence relation that connects properties to the substances. Okay, so properties. So big, old, red. All right, so here we have an object. Okay, excellent. So here we have an object. Okay. These properties inherit. How do you use the word inherit? Okay, these properties are inherited in this apple. Okay. So there's a supposed inherent relationship that connects the properties to the substances in which they are meant to inhere. Okay. So inherence. Okay. So that is the relationship of these properties to the substance. What's the relationship? Inherence. Okay, because these properties inhere in this substance. Okay, 1 second. All right, very good. So, the supposed inherence relation that connects properties to the substances in which they are meant to inhere, that's a relation, and a relation is a property. Okie dokie. So this inherence, yo, that's a property. Put that in quotes, because it's a property. Okay, very good. So then he does the dog example, but we're going to stick here with the apple. So if the substance attribute picture is right, this property, these properties here, big, red, old, inheres, right, in this apple. Okay, no problem, but here comes the kicker. Since inherence is a relation between a substance and its properties, it itself must also be a property. Uh-oh, here we go, infinite regress, because that property has to be inherent, has to inhere. So this property of inherence, okay, this property of inherence has to inhere to the apple, because the apple and these properties are said to inhere, but then that means it has an inherence relationship, which is a property. And so then that property has to inhere to the apple, which means it has an inherence relationship, which is a property. Oh no. That's a property. So then that property has to inhere in this apple. Okay, so let me just quickly indicate that, and then surely it will be done. Let me just indicate the relationship between this property of inherence and the apple. Oh fuck. But that's a property. Oh no! Oh no! Infinite regress. Okay, great. So we're going to read that one last time. So if the substance attribute picture is right, this property of being inherent inheres in the pair of us, me and my dog. So far, there's no big problem, but here comes the kicker. Since inherence is a relationship... Oh, no. Okay, that's wrong, but no problem. So far, we've seen the start of the problem. And just to make clear the kicker, since inherence is a relation between a substance and its properties, it itself must also be a property, and this sets up the vicious regress, for then inherence must inhere in yet another substance, and that inherence needs yet another substantial basis, and so on ad infinitum. The lack of any scientific evidence for substance is one good methodological reason to reject the substance attribute picture as unsupported. This regress argument is a second good reason for us to jettison the substance attribute model of reality, this time on the stronger grounds of incoherence. It don't make no sense. I mean, unless we say that an infinite regress can make sense. And I'm not quite sure why not. How is that incoherent? I mean, I know that it's bad. Incoherent. And if we reject this account of what it is to be a thing, we lose the bridge from the acknowledgement that we are thinking things to the conclusion that we are substances and so that we are selves. All right, this is an important sentence. So let's look at this again. Okie dokie. So, if we reject this account of what it is to be a thing, that a thing is a substance, then we lose that bridge that only substances, the premise that only substances can have properties, perform actions. So we know that we're thinking things, but are we thinking substances? So if we reject this account of what it is to be a thing, that it has to be a substance, then we lose the bridge from the acknowledgement that we are thinking things to the conclusion that we are thinking substances, and so that we are selves. All right, pretty big deal. Oh, fuck. So this effectively refutes the Cartesian argument for the reality of the self, as that argument depends on this bridge. Even if we granted the cogency of substance attribute metaphysics, another central premise of the Cartesian argument is manifestly false, vis-a-vis that only substances can act or have properties. Such composite, non-substantial entities as corporations, committees, colleges, and nations have plenty of properties and perform plenty of actions. There may be democracies or monarchies, banks or manufacturers, etc. Oh, they may be democracies or monarchies. They can be banks or manufacturers, etc. They also take positions and do so for reasons. They enact laws, go to war, pay dividends, and grant degrees. So yeah, you are as much of a self as a corporation is a person. Okay. And we certainly would not want to say that these composite entities are substances, on pain of multiplying substances endlessly or of rendering the term empty. There is therefore no reason not to believe that composite, non-substantial persons can have properties such as thinking as well. So while the cogito argument and its dialectical kin may demonstrate that we exist, again, at least at certain moments, they do nothing to demonstrate the kind of existence we enjoy, and in particular that we are selves as opposed to persons. They hence are irrelevant to the question we are addressing. We now set those arguments aside and turn to some more compelling arguments, each of which also has a long pedigree and each of which is alive and well in contemporary debates about the self. So, transcendental arguments for the existence of the self. Most contemporary arguments for the reality of the self are instances of what Immanuel Kant called a transcendental argument. In a transcendental argument, it is taken for granted that some phenomenon called the explanandum, the thing to be explained, is real, and then we argue that something else must be the case, the explanans, in order to explain the reality of that phenomenon that we took for granted exists or is real. Proponents of the existence of the self who adduce transcendental arguments for its reality, Kant included, argue that the reality of the self is necessary to explain one or all of the following phenomena, and here come the explanandum: the synchronic unity of consciousness and of its objects, the diachronic unity of personal identity, the sense of oneself in agency and subjectivity, and the possibility of individuating and distinguishing obviously distinct individual persons. Okay, so we have all these supposed phenomena, and we want to find the explanans to, or they wanted to find or to establish an explanans for them, and they were like the self. But hold on a second. Let's not take these things for granted. So we will consider synchronic and diachronic identity in this chapter. In each case, we will first set out the transcendental argument for the existence of the self as presented by its proponents, and then explain why the argument does not succeed in jack shit. Oh, in establishing its intended conclusion. We will consider agency in chapter 7 and individuation in chapter 8. Okay, so the latter two will be considered in chapters 7 and 8. You know what? I'm going to just make this smaller because this is getting a little bit frustrating trying to get things in. Yeah. Oh, I moved it up. All right, here we go. That's good. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so before we turn directly to these arguments from synchronic and diachronic identity, we should observe that there are two possible lines of attack against any transcendental argument. So on the one hand, one might deny that the purportedly obvious explanandum of the argument, the phenomenon that is taken for granted and which needs to be explained, is in fact a reality. We can deny that. One might, for instance, argue that the phenomenon in question has been misdescribed or that it is simply illusory. Or, on the other hand, one might argue that the purported explanans, that which explains the explanandum, is not required to explain that phenomenon, that we can explain it in some other way. Okay, so either there ain't nothing to explain or your explanation sucks. Is that real? I don't know. I thought that was an ad at first. I thought that was someone trying to get me to buy followers from them. Okay. I'm gonna write that down. On Kick, I have cause I'm streaming on Twitch, YouTube, and Kick. And on Kick, no, this is not real. This is definitely not real. No, this is an ad for it's a good one though, because I admit I'm staring at the chat hoping he'll say, "No, I'm not an ad. I really love your work in the philosophy of psychology and I've got a bunch of friends that really want to hang out with you." So the actual comment is, "Am at work now. I will join later with me friends. Add me on Discord." I'm going to write it down anyway. It's an ad. It's an ad. And part of me really doesn't believe that it's an ad, but I don't want to look stupid, so I'm just gonna keep saying that I know that it's obviously an ad. Or I mean, it's obviously, yeah, there are no friends trying to hang out with me right now. So yeah, you can either say that this shit don't need explaining, or your explanation ain't shit. Okay. So suppose, for instance, that someone presented a transcendental argument for the existence of the Abrahamic God based on the perfection of the world. We've all heard that one. That might begin by noting that the world is a perfect place, with everything just as it should be. This would be the explanandum. So how do we explain how the world could be so perfect? And then we argue that a necessary condition of this perfection is the world's having been created by a divine being. So the explanans. All right, Mom. That is, they point to the wonders of nature, the beauty of roses, the capacities of philosophers to dream up arguments like this, etc., and claim that none of this could have been produced by chance. Just as a beautiful work of art or an accurate watch must be produced by a great artist or a skilled watchmaker, a beautiful, precisely organized world must be produced by a great skilled creator. One might reply to this argument in two ways. First, one might argue that the world is not as perfect as it is made out to be, in that it contains a lot of suffering, for instance, or cases of really bad engineering, such as human knees. thus calling the explanandum into question. And then if there's nothing to be explained, there is no need to look for the explanation. This would be to deny the truth of the premise of the argument. Or one might concede the world's perfection, but argue that although it is perfect, natural, non-divine processes could just as well account for that perfection, such as evolution or sustained planning by expert committees. This second strategy concedes the premise and attacks the inference, denying the necessity of the explanans. Once again, either strategy, were it to succeed, would derail the argument, leaving the conclusion unsupported. In what follows, we will sometimes adopt one of these strategies and sometimes the other. So, transcendental arguments for the existence of the self. So, we said we were going to start with out of the four like things that or aspects that are used as premises as explanandum. Out of the four explananda, there was synchronic identity was the first one. So let's look at some transcendental arguments for the existence of the self that take synchronic identity as its explanandum, and the self as its explanans. So let us begin with the phenomenon of synchronic identity. There are two classes of transcendental argument for the existence of the self that take synchronic identity as their explanandum. The first, on the subjective side, is what is often called the argument from the unity of consciousness. So the subjective side, because of course only when you're like being a subject and being conscious would you think of consciousness as unity. You never look at somebody else and go, gosh, there must be a singular entity there. That can't possibly just be a bunch of neurons and programming. Something like that. So this argument takes as its explanandum the apparent fact that our experience seems unified in a common, simple subject as opposed to a committee of sensory and cognitive subjectivities. The second, on the objective side, concerns what is sometimes called the unity of the object. Okay, let us begin with arguments from the unity of the subject. In classical India, philosophers from both the Nyaya and the Vedanta traditions took the unity of consciousness as simply an obvious fact. They also each argued that this unity is explicable only if we suppose the existence of an Atman, or self that serves as the subject of all experience. They argued that the self has to be distinct from both mind and body on the grounds that it is the subject of both physical sensory experience and introspective experience of our own mental states. Since it is the subject of both kinds of experience and subjects are distinct from their objects, the Atman, they argued, can be neither mind nor body. I'm going to read that again. So, we're talking about synchronic identity as our explanandum, and we're talking about there is first category. Okay, so two classes. One is the subjective side, and the other is the objective side. So we're going to start with the objective side. And so first of all, they were like, consciousness is singular. Nothing more to be said about that. And so then, well, something can be said about that, but nothing to question it or deny it in that sense about. So they also each argue that this unity is explicable only if we suppose the existence of an Atman, or self that serves as the subject of all experience. So a singular subject only can explain the singularity of experience, the apparent singularity. So they argue that the self has to be distinct from both mind and body on the grounds that it is the subject of both physical sensory experience and introspective experience of our own mental states. So a thing can't like look at itself is the idea, right? So, I mean, look at its own. So if you are experiencing something, then you are not that thing, right? So if you are experiencing your body, then you are not your body. If you are experiencing your mind, then you must not be your mind, okay? And I hope Om keeps up. I'm disappointed I started so late, and he is now sleeping. So, since it is the subject of both kinds of experience and subjects are distinct from their objects, well, the Atman, they argued, can be neither mind nor body. Moreover, they argued all of our experiences are present in a single subjectivity. That is, I do not take my visual experience to be experienced by one subject, my auditory experience by another, and my awareness of my puzzlement about the self by yet another. To do so, they argue, would be to take myself to be in inner committee of multiple subjects cooperating to know the world. This, they say, would fly in the face of the fact that my experience is so obviously unified and is all available to me, not some of it, to each of my many strange inner associates. It just seems obvious, they take it, that a single subject, me, is the subject of all of these experiences and that they all constitute a single inner life. So, they argue, the self must not only be distinct from body and mind, but it must be unitary. Great. So, distinct from body and mind and unitary. So, the unitary part... Well, is this whole paragraph, and the distinct part is there. Great. And this answers our question about what Jay Garfield would respond to defining the self as pure awareness. Where was that? Where did I write that down? Here we go. Oh, but I was wondering about Kundrakirti, what Kundrakirti would have to say about the self being pure awareness. But, there we go. Okay, great. Carrying on. So, finally, proponents of this position argue this unity can only be apparent if it is also real. That I can't even think that my experience is unified unless it really is. And what do we call this dumbass argument that just takes for granted everything that we think? Like a naive realism. And that's what we'll call that. I think that applies here. So here is how this goes. I obviously experience myself as a cognitive and experiential unity, as a single subject of experience. That fact, they say, leads to two possibilities. Either that experience is veridical and I am such a unity, or it is illusory. But here is the catch. Even if it is illusory, the illusion is possible only if there is a single subject to be fooled. Because even if it's illusory, okay, so it's an illusion, you said. Okay, so then what is accepting that illusion? There has to be a single thing accepting that illusion. That is, even for me to believe myself to be unitary, when I am actually manifold, there must be a single me who believes in that unity. So maybe all my other aspects are spread across different subjects. But, okay, but there's still a super core, me. There has to be, bro, is what they say. So this had been doing such a good job of not freezing. Let's see whether it comes back. So either way, I must, at some level, be a unitary being. To put this point another way, the appearance of my own unity cannot actually be an illusion. So since I appear to be a unity, I must be one. And since I am a unity, whereas my mind and body are each complex multiplicities of more basic phenomena, I must be distinct from those. So they conclude, I am a self. This is the classical Indian version of the argument. Alright, I'm gonna force quit that and open it up again. Sweet. Hopefully that works. Okay, great. All right, back to it. So, they conclude, I am a self. This is the classical Indian version of the argument. Kant offers a similar argument in the transcendental deduction of the categories section of the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. There he argues that the phrase I think must be capable of accompanying any experience or judgment. Otherwise, that experience would not be experienced as mine. That sense of being mine is essential, he argues, for anything being experienced at all. Moreover, for it to be possible even to judge that multiple experiences are all mine, the referent of the I to which each is referred must be the same. Contemporary phenomenologists often refer to this as the for-me-ness of experience, a kind of pre-reflective, unarticulated, implicit, naive, or primordial taking of all outer and inner awareness as mine that constitutes a single field of subjectivity. We will return to these formulations in the next chapter. So these contemporary philosophers thus follow Kant in taking seriously the intuition that any experience that did not somehow announce itself with a special marker as my experience wouldn't be experience at all. That single field of experience, they argue, demands unification by a single subject. Kant, like many classical Indian Orthodox philosophers, including those from the Nyaya, the Mimamsa, and the Vedanta traditions, Kant takes this unifying self to be a transcendental ego or a pure subject that is never an object of experience. Many of Kant's own reasons for this are complex and beyond the scope of this discussion. But one reason is that Kant argues that space and time are projected by the self as loci for objects. What are loci, space, and time? Are projected by the self as loci for objects. You know, there's something very true about that. I mean, we will say not by the self, but by the brain. I think that aligns kind of really nicely with Donald Hoffman's. He talks a lot about space-time is doomed, and that they are just constructions, cognitive constructs. Maybe there's two ends, I don't know. So this is because to experience anything as an object is to experience it in space and time. We can't imagine a non-spatiotemporal object. So, he concludes, space and time are not themselves objects among other objects, but rather the way we experience all objects, structures that we must presuppose in order to experience anything as an object. That's wild, bro. That's wild that he said that, bro. Immanuel Kant had that idea? What? That is really... I knew he was smart, but god damn, bro. God damn. So the self, but the self Kant claims is essentially a subject, and so it cannot be an object. And he concludes from this that while all objects are found in space and time, the transcendental ego lies outside of space and time as their precondition. This transcendental ego is different from what he calls the empirical ego, the mind we know when we engage in introspection. So the transcendental ego observes the empirical ego. Okay, and it is distinct or different from the transcendental ego is different from anything physical, since both inner and outer objects of experience are found in time, and outer ones in space as well. The transcendental ego, therefore, has a mode of being entirely distinct from its objects, and so distinct from any spatiotemporally located person. It functions as the ground of our awareness, not only of the external world, but also of our own existence as cognitive agents. And so, once again, the transcendental ego must be distinct from our physical or psychological manifestations. I really like what I came up with yesterday about the eye. Right? About how, who was it that was talking about, Wittgenstein, I think, was talking about how we take the, so this was chapter 2. I don't know. Let's see. Here we go. Yes. So Wittgenstein presents the relation we instinctively presuppose between the self and the world as analogous to that between the eye and the visual field, right? Well, you know how you understand that actually you have two eyes? They are the two quote unquote subjects, and they also can be objects to each other if if the nose weren't there, they were more protruded, and what have you. Point being that I feel like that is a really good it's not an explanation, I guess it's kind of, yeah, it's a metaphor, and it's a useful reliance. It's a useful yeah, a little detail about that metaphor that, anyway, I'm done trying to say what I'm trying to say. Okay, carrying on. Now we're on this page. Okay, carrying on. So, note that this account of the transcendental ego and the arguments for its reality accord with the way we characterize the self in chapter 1. It is neither mind nor body, but that which has a mind and a body. It is always subject or agent and never object. It is thus clear that these are arguments for the existence of the very kind of self with which we are concerned in this investigation. This is not accidental. For as we just noted, both mind and body are complex entities. Neither is experienced as simple, and neither is a plausible seat of unified experience. Moreover, mind and body can each be taken as an object in introspection, interoception, or proprioception. Therefore, these proponents of the reality of the self argue, neither mind nor body is that with which we identify when we use the first person pronoun I to denote the subject that experiences them as its mind and body. These arguments thus begin with the idea that we identify with something in the subject side of experience, not anything on the object side. And these proponents of a transcendental ego or Atman argue And these proponents of a transcendental ego or Atman argue something simple is needed on that side to unify the manifold of our experience. For everything I experience is, by definition, and this is the premise of the transcendental argument, experienced as mine in a single field of reality, not as disconnected experiences that might belong to different subjects. Likewise, the eyes. Going back to it, bro. You experience a single visual field. We know for a fact that there are two separate visual fields being unified by a whole bunch of neurons. Great. Okay. So if this is so, and this is the inference in this transcendental argument, all right, I'm gonna go back. For everything I experience is, by definition, experienced as mine in a single field of reality, not as disconnected experiences that might belong to different subjects. If this is so, and there must be a single consciousness to which all those objects appear. This is the self. Kant and his followers, we might say, are only making much more precise and systematic the basic instinctive intuition of the reality of the self that we explored in Chapter 1. This is the transcendental argument for the reality of the self from the subjective side. We will return to these arguments shortly to see how, despite how plausible they may sound, they fail to establish the reality of the self. But as Urio Takara in India and Kant in Prussia each also pointed out, a similar argument can be mounted from the side of the object. Not only yeah, exactly. And we're going to dismantle that. Okay, that's what's happening at this point. Hey again, Dharma. Okay, so, but as Takara in India and Kant in Prussia each also pointed out, I thought Kant was English, or French. Immanuel Kant. I had no idea he was Prussian, bro. Actually, I'm not going to look that up right now. But as Urio Takara in India and Kant in Prussia each also pointed out, a similar argument can be mounted from the side of the object. Not only is there a problem to be solved about the unity of the subjective field of experience, but there is a problem regarding how individual objects that we experience are unified. This second group of arguments raise what is called in cognitive science the binding problem. This is the puzzle posed when we try to explain how we bind properties together as properties of single objects, taking an egg to be oval and white and an apple to be round and red, but never, when gazing at an egg and an apple, attaching the roundness to the egg or the whiteness to the apple. When we consider our experience from this side, we ask what could unify the various features of the objects we experience, shape, color, sound, smell, etc., into a single object of experience. In each case, those who advance these arguments claim that only a self could explain the manifest unity in question. To take Urio Takara's example, if I watch a person dancing, I experience color, shape, sound, perhaps smell, and texture if I am close enough, and I am aware of all of this changing over time. I may also experience different kinds of affective responses to the dance, such as anticipation, pleasure, and disappointment when it is all over. I do not, however, experience these as disjointed sensations, a bit of movement, a bit of color, a bit of pleasure, but rather as properties of a single object or event, extended and articulated in space and time. That is, I bind all of these sensations and affective responses to experience them as properties of a unified object of experience. Just as the unity of the subject was the key premise of the transcendental argument we just discussed, the unity of the object is the premise of the second kind of transcendental argument. The inference is then straightforward. For all of these multiple and distinct properties to be bound to a single object requires that they all be represented by a single subject. If they were not, one subject might assign a property to one object and another to another. Because what, these mechanisms can't coordinate, bro? Moreover, that single subject can't simply be one or another cognitive state or process. This is so for two reasons. First, even cognitive states and processes get unified in this way, bound to a single cognitive subject in introspection. We do not experience our inner life as fragmented into unrelated parts experienced by different subjects any more than we experience external objects as fragmented. Second, because multiple cognitive states and processes are involved in any such variegated experience, that which binds them must be something beyond those states and processes. So, this argument concludes, there must be a single subject of experience to which all of these properties are present, a single subject that binds them into a single representation, into a single object. This, the proponent of the argument concludes, is the fuck off, the self. This froze again, and I haven't figured out why it freezes, and so that's frustrating. Okay, we're gonna... Because what happened was I clicked over there because, oh yeah, another ad on Keg. And that's gonna happen. That's great. Don't be distracted, son. How can it freeze already, bro? That's upsetting. Carrying on. So this argument concludes there must be a single subject of experience to which all of these properties are present that binds them to a single object. This, the proponent of the argument concludes, is the self. All right, well, each of these arguments, whether from the side of the subject or from the side of the object, is an argument for a transcendent self, a self that stands behind both mind and body, and therefore that is distinct from both. This fact should convince us of two things. First, that we are talking about a self here in the sense relevant to this discussion, as opposed to a person. And second, that something has gone terribly wrong metaphysically. It should convince us that we are talking about the self because it perfectly captures that idea of the subject that stands behind mind and body as their possessor, that to which we seem to be so atavistically attached. That is the self, not the person. It should convince us that something has gone terribly wrong because when we reflect carefully, it does not seem at all plausible that we really exist outside of space and time and distinct from our psychophysical embodiment. I mean, come on. This is so despite the fact that prior to reflection, as when we fantasize about having someone else's body or mind, that is exactly how we imagine ourselves. Okay, so it's obvious with just a bit of reflection, even if before a bit of reflection, it's exactly our belief. But it's obviously wrong with just a bit of reflection. And, just incorporating a bit of your knowledge. And the fact that our pre-reflective intuitions and what we know to be the case on reflection are so different should remind us that our instincts and fantasies are not always rational or good guides to reality. In case you somehow flip and forgot, the task of the kind of philosophical reflection in which we are now engaged is often not to confirm what we believe intuitively, but to correct the errors to which our intuitions are prone, or as errors might say, but to correct the errors we evolved to make. All of this suggests that something is seriously wrong with all of these transcendental arguments, regardless of how plausible they appear to be to that evolved intuition. It is now time to see just what goes wrong. So let us ask, in each case, just want to see if this is still frozen. Yep, it is. So we're just going to shut that down. All of this suggests that something is seriously wrong with all of these transcendental arguments, regardless of how plausible they appear to be. It is now time to see just what goes wrong. So let us ask, in each case, is it the premise or the inference that is at fault? In these cases, the answer is both. For now, we will consider some reasons to be suspicious of the premise, suspicions that we will confirm later. We will then turn to the inference, which we will show to be invalid. Let us first briefly consider the premise that is shared by all of the arguments we have just considered. we are asked to grant that our experience is unified. To be sure, this is superficially plausible. Our experience does seem to be unified, at least prior to reflection. But we should be careful here and not simply assume that our pre-reflective intuitions are correct. After all, that alleged unity has not been proven, and it might well be as illusory as the self that is supposed to be distinct from mind and body. In order to see that this may be so, let us return for an analogy to the case of perception. Is he finally going to do the eye thing? No, he is not. We know that we are subject to perceptual illusions. For that reason, we would not expect to explain the fact that the lines of the Mueller-Lyer illusion, page 7, appear to be unequal in length by demonstrating they really are unequal in length. Page 7. Oh, look, they appear to be unequal in length. Now, let us set out to demonstrate that they are unequal in length. Hold on a second, you arrogant, ignorant piece of shit. What about the fact that they appear guarantees to you that they are? Is it you knowing absolutely nothing about perception and cognition and your fallibility and the fact that you're just like molecules bouncing around doing their best? Oh, okay. Instead, we would explain it by conceding that they are in fact equal in length and then showing how those arrowheads fool our visual system into representing them as unequal. We would be wrong to take the appearance of inequality as a guide to reality, and we would be correct to be suspicious of the accuracy of our own perceptual faculties. By analogy, since we know that we are subject to cognitive or introspective illusions as well as perceptual illusions, we should not take the fact that the objects of our experience appear to be unified to be explained by showing that they are unified. It may but well be that, as in the Mueller-Lyer case, this appearance is to be explained not by its accuracy, but by our susceptibility to an introspective error. We will postpone detailed discussion of this issue for now, but we will return to it in Chapter 5. Here, we will show that the transcendental arguments we have been considering fail due to the invalidity of the inference from their premises to the conclusion that there is a self. So, let us set aside any doubts about this premise and grant it for a moment, just for the sake of argument. That is, let us suppose that our experience is unified, at least in our introspective awareness of it, and that the objects we experience are bound into propertied unities. Okay, so this apple is a unity with properties. Okay, let's suppose so. Even if we do so, however, we will see that the inference in each of these arguments is invalid. That is, even if we grant the apparent unity of the subject or of the object, we need not accept the conclusion that this unity can only be explained by the existence of a singular self, let alone by a transcendent self that stands behind all that we experience. We now turn to the critique of the inferential step in these arguments. Okay. So first, we should bear in mind that when we talk about the unity of our experience, we are talking about the experience of an apparent world, a world as delivered to us by being constructed by our sensory and cognitive faculties in response to the impinging sensory stimulation. So the inference in each of these is invalid. So this is, I guess, the first thing. We're talking about an apparent world. A world as delivered to us by being constructed by our sensory and cognitive faculties in response to sensory stimulation. How does that world arise? Well, light falls on our eyes. Chemicals interact with receptors in our nose. Fluctuations in air pressure are registered by our ears, etc. These interactions cause impulses to travel up our nerves, like our optic nerve, for instance. Up our optic nerve to our brains, where a cascade of neural processes occurs. resulting in our experience of a world. That experience, as I pointed out in chapter 2, is literally constructed by us, not passively received. I want it to stop fucking switching to standard mode. I gotta turn these gestures off at some point. Oh, it's just losing me because I put an object in front of it. All right, very good. Or not an object, a set of properties. Okay, so first we should bear in mind that when we... Oh, no. That experience, as I pointed out in chapter 2, is literally constructed by us, not passively received. That experience, not the external world, which appears to be a collection of multiple entities, is what, according to the proponents of the arguments we have been considering, is unified by a self. So, as we think about the construction of this unified experience, let us consider some apt analogies to this process. A large construction crew can build a single building from multifarious materials with the entire project in their collective intention, but with no single member cognizant of the entire operation. A congressional committee can produce legislation about which no single member is fully knowledgeable. A college can graduate a student in virtue of the efforts of many faculty and staff members without any single person surveying all of her accomplishments. Just so, a plethora of subconscious, perceptual, and cognitive processes, or conscious, fuck, you just pissed me off. No, it's okay. You're a philosopher, not a neuroscientist. Or I should have put that on the sub part. Just so, a plethora of, experienced or not, perceptual and cognitive processes can jointly generate the representation of unitary objects in a unified experiential field. Okay? Although, I guess, yes. In that case, yeah. Unlikely to experience, yeah. Still, I don't know. Am I going to stand by this? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not sure what I think about this. Okay, so there is no need for their interaction to be integrated or managed in any single neural or cognitive structure. Indeed, this is precisely how the brain appears to work. The fact that the field and the objects in it are experienced in introspection as unified does not entail that this unity is achieved by a unified subject of consciousness any more than the fact a legislature passes a single bill entails that there is a single legislator. No more than the fact that a student earns a single degree entails that she was taught only by a single teacher, or created only by a single teacher. It entails only that there is a set of processes robust and integrated enough to create a single manifold of experience. An organism may be necessary for this task, but not a self. So even the unity of experience would not entail the existence of a unified subject of experience, nor does a unified object presuppose a unified subject. This shows, so even the unity of experience would not entail the existence of a unified subject of experience, nor does a unified object presuppose a unified subject. This shows that the inferences in both the argument from the unity of the subject and in the argument from the unity of the object fail to establish the reality of the self. Those who defend the unity of the subject might respond, oh, I'm on the edge of my seat. What might they respond? All right, let's see if that doesn't freeze. So those who defend the unity of the subject might respond that this reply begs the question. That is, that it assumes the conclusion it is trying to establish. This is because they might say that it presupposes that a disunified subject can even have unified experience, which is the very question at issue. Thus, they might argue we must begin by granting the premise that a unified experiential field can only be the field of a unified self. Since my reply does not grant this, but it presupposes instead, well, the opposite, that a disunified subject can experience a unified objective field, the proponent continues, I have assumed what is to be proven. Just like we're saying that they have assumed what is to be proven. So we should not be convinced by this dialectical move. However, in replying to the transcendental arguments in this way, I do not beg the question. Instead, it is the proponent of the self who does so. Yeah, because you said it's possible. They're saying it's necessary. So what you said was not the opposite, because you just said it's possible. And, yes, and that's exactly what I see. See here the word possible italicized. Got you. I do not beg the question. Instead, it's you fuckers that are begging the question. This is because they assume without argument that only a unified subject can have unitary experience. I provide examples of cases where complex entities produce single products, showing that this is possible. I also point to the complexity of the central nervous system to show that this analogy is plausible. And we can thus see that the assumption by the proponent of the self that only a unified subject could have a unified experience is not an innocent assumption, simply because we have examples of fucking disunified agents that produce unified products. A unified building does not presuppose a unified builder, nor does a single act of Congress presuppose a single legislator as its author, nor does a single graduate presuppose a single teacher. So, a unified field of experience cannot be assumed to presuppose a self. That field can emerge from the cooperation of a multiplicity of cognitive functions, and most likely does, even if that's hard to imagine. To get from unity to the self requires an opportunity that only a unitary self could accomplish the task. Nope. To get from unity to the self requires an argument that only a unitary self could accomplish the task, and this has not been proven. It is hence the proponent of this argument, not the critic, who assumes that which is to be proven. The contemporary philosopher-psychologist Thomas Metzinger defends the position I am urging. He argues that our cognitive architecture reflexively creates what he calls a phenomenal self model. That's right. Our cognitive architecture reflexively creates a phenomenal self model. That is a complex representation of a self. That model includes representations of our body, of our current sensory state, of our cognitive processes, and of our orientation to the world, as well as representations of our relation to the past and the future. It represents us as agents, as centers of experience, and as extended in time and in space. And this representation induces a first-person perspective on our experience through our identification with it. That model may have some value. It may help us to orient ourselves in space and time, for instance. Nonetheless, Metzinger emphasizes, while these cognitive processes give us a sense of self, and while they create a perspective from which that self appears to be the center or locus of our experience and agency, the representation is false. It constitutes an illusion. That is, we cannot infer from a sense of self to the reality of a self. And we cannot infer from the fact that a unity is presented to us that that unity is real. So much for arguments for the reality of the self that are based on synchronic unity. Okay? Even if we grant their crucial premises, and once again, a bit later we will call even those premises into question, their conclusion doesn't follow from those premises. Great. Done. Now, transcendental arguments for the existence of the self-diachronic identity. Okay, great. Well, but my... Oh, right, because I quit out of it. Damn, okay, so... Boom. Alright, good. Okay, so transcendental arguments for the existence of the self, diachronic identity. All right, here we go. But even if we grant that the experience of synchronic unity can be achieved by a but even if we grant that that the experience of synchronic unity can be achieved by a set of selfless, interlocking perceptual and cognitive processes, one might argue that diachronic unity presupposes more than that. We will now consider another argument familiar in both Indian and Western philosophy. Stripped of the details that distinguish the various versions in which it appears, it goes like this. We experience ourselves as extended over time, as having existed in the past, as continuing as the same being now. As continuing as the same. As the same being now. We experience ourselves as extended over time, as having existed in the past, as continuing as the same being now, and as hopefully continuing to exist in the future. If we were not aware of ourselves as extended over time, this argument continues, we could not be aware of ourselves as existent at all. This is because even to be aware of oneself as existing at a moment of time requires one to think of that moment in relation to other moments of time at which one existed. That is, to experience myself as existing now is to experience myself as existing at this moment, which is later than another moment at which I existed and prior to another in which I may exist. Our experience of the present hence includes our memories of past times and our anticipation of future times as times already experienced or as times to be experienced by me. If it did not, it would not even be the experience of the present, since that only makes sense in relation to the past and future. Therefore, the proponent of this kind of argument concludes, for me to have any experience at all, I must endure over time. That thing that endures over time, moreover, must be a self. The surveillance is what was frozen. Moreover, I've read that. No, I have not. Moreover, this argument continues, if I were nothing but a succession with no endurance over time, then memory would be impossible. That's so dumb. This is because the subject I am now could not have existed in the past, and so when I take myself to be remembering, the experience I take myself to remember would be that of somebody else. Well, that isn't memory. To remember something, I myself would have had to experience it. And on the succession view, the subject to experience the past would no longer be around, and I would not have been around to experience the past. Nor, this argument continues, would any of my anticipation of future states be genuine anticipation, since I could not expect to be around to enjoy them. So, since memory is necessarily of my past, and anticipation necessarily of my future, without a past and future that are mine, there would be no memory or anticipation at all. But without memory and anticipation, there could be no temporality, no sense of time. You fucking assume. To any of my experience, no sense of time to any of my experience, and with no temporality, there is no experience, there could be no time at which anything ever happened. Hence, my continued existence over time is a necessary condition of any experience at all. Let us now assess this argument. It makes all the sense in the world to accept the premises of this transcendental argument. We do have experience, and our experience is temporal. That is, we experience our present as poised not between an abstract past and future, but as poised between our lived past and anticipated future. And we should grant the proponents of this argument the premises that we do have memories. That's true. And that memory requires not just that there was a past experience, but that past experience was, at least in some sense, mine. And that in memory, I represent myself as both the subject of that past experience and as the subject of the present memory. And the same goes for anticipation. I must anticipate my future, not some future in general. The questions we must ask, though, are these. 1. Does the What is my symbol for counter? Counter. So we have the, okay, so argument, response. Okay. So the questions we must ask, though, are these. Does the fact that I have had experiences in the past and hopefully will have them in the future require that I have a persistent self? Does the fact that memory and anticipation represent me to myself as identical over time mean that I must be identical over time in order to remember the past and to anticipate the future? Or is it possible, hear me out, that a selfless person could be the subject of memory and anticipation, represented in those attitudes as identical over time, despite there being no self that persists from past to future? To ask these questions is to question the entailment between the premises and the conclusion of this influential argument. And just as in the case of the arguments for synchronic identity, we will see that there is no such entailment. The inference is not valid. This argument, like those, turns out to be invalid and so provides no reason to believe in a self. Once again, thinking about corporate or institutional states and processes can help here. We speak easily about institutional memory, where that memory is carried by a company or a college or even a family without it being carried by any single member in its entirety. Such memory may extend over many generations, passed from one individual to another, sometimes orally, sometimes in a written archive, sometimes as a set of practices that each generation learns from the preceding, or even as a pattern of charges on a silicon wafer. But this hardly implies that each complex institution must have a persistent singular self to make its persistence through time and its institutional memory possible. To be sure, it is important for an institution, when it remembers an event in its past, to have been involved in that event, and institutional planning requires the assumption of the continued existence of that institution in the future, but that hardly entails that the institution has a self. After all, like Hume's church, an organization can persist through time, can retain records of its past, and can plan for the future without there being any single component or core to its being that persists, that retains its institutional memory, or that forges its plans. The same can be true regarding our own temporal extension. Recall the important distinction we drew in the first chapter between the Okay. Um. So the same can be true regarding our own temporal extension. Recall the important distinction we drew in the first chapter between the person and the self. The memory and anticipation argument is a good argument for the existence of the person in the past and the future. To remember having met you in Ulaanbaatar 5 years ago, I must be the same person who encountered you then. And to anticipate meeting you 5 years hence in Wagga Wagga, I must think of myself as the same person I am now 5 years hence. And mutatis mutandis for the way I think of your diachronic identity. But that kind of identity, like the kind of institutional identity presupposed by institutional memory and anticipation, does not presuppose the identity of a self that persists through all the changes I suffer over that decade. It only presupposes psychophysical causal connectedness. That is, the identity and persistence of a person. The fact that my mental state now counts as a memory reflects its causal history and its content, not how do I want to phrase that? The fact that my mental state now counts as a memory reflects its causal history and content, not its singular encoder or something. It was caused initially by our encounter in that yurt, and it has that meeting as its current content. No relation to a self is required to underwrite those connections. The fact that my anticipation of our meeting at the cricket ground in a few years' time is an anticipation has to do with its content and my representation of my personal continuity over that stretch of time. Again, no need for a self here, big dog. So the transcendental argument for the existence of the self on the grounds of the need to explain diachronic identity fails, in the same way that the transcendental argument for synchronic identity fails. In each case, the only identity that follows from the premises, the only identity that in each case, the only identity that follows from the premises, the only identity that is required to explain our experience is personal identity, not the numerical identity of an enduring self. Once again, even if we grant the premises of this argument, they constitute no reason to believe the conclusion. We have now seen that these transcendental arguments, whether grounded in the supposed synchronic unity of the subject, in the synchronic unity of the object, or in the diachronic unity of the subject, we have now seen that these transcendental arguments fail to establish the reality of a transcendent self. At best, they deliver the reality of the person. At worst, they simply beg the question. In the next chapter, we consider arguments for the existence not of a transcendent substantial self, but of a more minimal self. Some of these arguments will also be transcendental in form. Like those we have just canvassed, they each have both classical and contemporary instances. We got more time because baby girl's gonna go on the Peloton, gonna take a shower before we hang out, so we have more time. So we're gonna do another chapter. We got through that slickety split, bro. So we're gonna move to the minimal self. Just seeing about how long it is. It is long. Okay, it is long. 34 pages. But we got through that. What was that? 20 something pages? I think we might be able to do this, bro. So I will see you back